Hello, we continue now with McCabe and Mrs Miller. I noted last time that Robert Altman was a famous risk taker and experimenter in his projects and in the sometimes unorthodox ways in which he filmed them. In McCabe and Mrs Miller, these methods included, as I noted, building an actual frontier town on a mountainside in British Columbia to serve as the film's set, a town that was still being constructed while Altman was filming so that the town and the film developed together, adding to the sense of raw authenticity that Altman strove for in things like the overlapping dialogue, in the grainy texture of the film stock, and in the muted, darkened colors. The building of the set during the filming helps to account for another radical departure from conventional practice. Altman actually filmed McCabe and Mrs Miller in strict sequence to reflect the development of the plot and the building of the town. Now, this is almost unheard of. Most films, then and now, are shot out of sequence at different locations in order to economize time and money. Not here. But the filming of this movie, scene by scene, developed with the construction of the Presbyterian Church set. In fact, the town's fluid state of construction is a trope within the film. For example, when McCabe first arrives, the church, for which the settlement is named, is still being constructed. It's completed only in the scene when he returns with the three prostitutes at sunset, and we see the cross being affixed to the top of the steeple. Similarly, the construction of McCabe's whorehouse, later expanded by Mrs. Miller's demand for a bathhouse, takes up 30 minutes of the film. When McCabe brings back the three original prostitutes to open the business, he, like Altman, finds a half-finished set. Now, he has to rely on tents then until the brothel is ready. And there's a spontaneity in this process, both for the characters in the film and for Altman as director. They are both, in this respect, Altman and McCabe, taking risks, making things up as they go along. Now, like McCabe, who creates himself and who plays the role of a card shark in pursuit of his economic dream, Altman was famously open to incorporating suggestions from actors and changes in the script in risky ways as the circumstances and inspirations dictated. While McCabe certainly then shares Altman's independence, risk-taking, and even his stubbornness, there is hardly in this film, I think, a directorial self-portrait, because McCabe, after all, lacks the director's awareness of the bankruptcy of the bootstrap myth and the bankruptcy of the American ideas of the West as the land of boundless opportunity. McCabe embraces these. Altman subverts them. Nor does McCabe, who forms a partnership with Mrs. Miller sort of under duress, share Altman's emphasis on creative collaboration and on the bonds, the necessary bonds of community that arise from those partnerships. Under Mrs. Miller's direction, the brothel, not the church, quickly becomes the center of the community life in this settlement, insofar as there is any community, because up until now it has been merely an atomized collection of ragged miners and drifters. Now, rituals are always important in Altman films because they help to forge what sense of community there is, and the brothel becomes a place of ritual. This begins with a kind of baptism in which we see the newly arrived horse splashing and singing in the bathhouse, and the sense of ritual continues as they sing hymns at Bart's funeral. The prostitutes also celebrate seasonal events with rituals. When we see them dancing with their johns, for example, to the sound of Silent Night, as the winter winds howl outside. Within, there's a kind of cozy, golden-lit interior, where what we find is whimsy and good cheer, and even something like, as the song says, heavenly peace. Christ's birthday is celebrated in conjunction with that of one of the prostitutes, with an elaborate cake made by Lily, now relieved of her sexual duties. And in this spirit of communion, the first real communion to be fostered in this town, Mrs. Miller's women want to share that cake with everyone, including McCabe. For the lonely men in this settlement, these women are, in the words of Leonard Cohen's plangent song, really the Sisters of Mercy. As the young drifter soon discovers, they represent not only community in this region, but also a kind of healing, a kind of comfort, a balm for the turbulence and the travails of the male roving and drinking and gambling, which heretofore has been their only way of life. Now, we don't ever see sex occurring in the brothel. And there are no longer now, with Mrs. Miller's arrival, any hysterical incidents as there were in the tents. The atmosphere of the place isn't tawdry but cheerful. It is, in short, a well-run business. So ironically then, the brothel actually exercises a civilizing influence on these ragged men, just as Mrs. Miller told McCabe that it would. But at the end of last class, I noted that the film's tone darkens when, just outside the brothel, Bart Coyle is accidentally killed in a fight, and later that evening, the Harrison Shaughnessy Mining Company representatives arrive. The structure of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, if you think of it, really consists of a series of arrivals. First, McCabe riding into town at the start of the film, then McCabe returning with the 3 prostitutes, then Mrs. Miller arriving, followed by the prostitutes from Seattle, and now Sears and Hollander arriving on behalf of the mining company. They will be followed then in turn by the young cowboys' arrival and by the trio of killers arriving, hired by the mining company. The company's official representatives that we find attempt to buy McCabe out of his self-made dream, which has begun now to turn a sizable profit. Sears tries to flatter McCabe by addressing him as a fellow man of business and common sense, calling him the town's leading citizen. But even though he's half drunk, McCabe sees the avarice underlying this pitch, and he responds to it with mockery and insults. Have a look.
Mr. McCabe, we're interested in the mining deposits up here.
Well, the truth of the matter is that I would like to have a little drink. You care to join me?
Oh, we'd like to buy you a drink, Mr. McCabe.
Wait a minute. You got a turd in your pocket or something. Who the hell is we?
This is Ernie Hollander. He's with me.
Ah, you want a drink, Ernie?
Sure, I like a drink, but my stomach can't handle it anymore.
Look, Mr. McCabe, I don't want you to misunderstand.
Oh, no, there's no misunderstand. You want to buy out the zinc? Go ahead. I don't know any goddamn zinc mine. Hey, Robbie, get us a bottle here, will you? Hey, you boys know about the frog who got ate by the eagle? There's this big old eagle. He's walked down and gobbled up those little frogs, see? And the little frog is inside the eagle, and they're way up in the air, and the frog is working his way back in the eagle, and he's working his way back. And he looks out at the eagle's ass, and he says, "Hey, eagle," he says, how high up are we? And the eagle says, "Well," he says, "we're up about 1 mile, 2 miles." And the frog says, "Well, you wouldn't shit me now, would you?"
That's good. That's really good, Mr. McCabe. I'll have to remember that. Mr. McCabe, we know you're a businessman, and we're businessmen, so what we'd like to do is we'd like to make you an offer. Buy out all your holdings here in Presbyterian Church.
All right. How much?
I'd like to point out a few things.
Oh, no, why don't you just tell me how much, and you can point out all the goddamn things. What the hell kind of cover is that?
That's sealskin.
Oh.
The company won't go over $5,500, I know that.
Well, that ain't high enough, is it?
Well, no, listen, we just bought out Sheehan down there for $1,600. His hotel, his livery stable, the whole works.
Well, now, you certainly got fucked there, didn't you?
Listen, Mr. McCabe, if we can't talk this over reasonably, we were empowered to work with you because we were led to believe that you were the town's leading citizen. A man of good common sense, if you know what I mean.
Roebuck, if a frog had wings, he wouldn't bump his ass so much, phony.
What?
Well, I got better offers than that from Monkey Ward. So now if you boys want to talk business with me, what you got to do is you got to get your offer way up there in the air where it belongs. Smalley, set up that no-limit game for me, will you?
Well, man, what do you think of that?
Well, he's a real smart-ass, he is.
McCabe's hostility toward the men, the representatives of the company, is fueled by his frustration with Mrs. Miller, who has just exposed his limitations as a businessman, pointed out that he could hardly add and subtract. He's felt emasculated by this, but really emasculated since her arrival. And he wants to regain his manhood in her eyes by this act of resistance to the mining corporation. But McCabe's also hostile to them because he knows that these men represent the worst and greediest side of capitalism. He embraces capitalism, but this is capitalism on a huge scale. These men will want to buy him out so that they can own the town, make it a company town in which the mine workers will be completely dependent upon the company. Such a deal would certainly threaten the fragile sense of community that I've suggested the brothel has managed to foster. But above all, McCabe is, in rejecting their offer, thinking of himself. Such a deal would be a denial of the independence that McCabe values as an American dreamer. The offer, while initially too low, would, if he accepted it, give McCabe more money than he'd ever seen before. And so from a business point of view, the deal makes some sense. But McCabe rejects it here with surly humor for the reasons I've noted, but also for one more. He rejects it because he is intrinsically a gambler who likes taking risks and is always looking for something bigger from the start. He thinks Sears is bluffing when he sets a limit on the payout because McCabe's a dreamer who has brought something into existence out of nothing and doesn't want to relinquish it and likes the idea of pushing as far as he can. He believes in capitalism in principle, but this kind of personal enterprise is something that these corporate men cannot understand. Thus, mocking them, McCabe jokingly calls Sears Roebuck. Sears Roebuck is the name of a famous American company, another being Montgomery Ward, which he plays on in this conversation. Now, note that McCabe also tells a homespun proverb, which he has trotted out earlier, about the frog. He knows that the frog that tries to leap and bumps its ass is earthbound. He knows that he himself, as a dreamer, has earthbound limits, that gravity will pull him down so that he'll bump his ass, but he'd still like to have wings and wants to try to soar as best he can. He'll risk it. Now, just as he used that line, you remember, in rejecting Sheehan's partnership offer, so now he uses it to reject Sears' offer. Even before hearing the mining company's terms, he tells a joke that features another frog that is clearly intended to offend these representatives. The joke only baffles these humorless functionaries, but there's more in it than they realize. McCabe's point is that he's the frog and the mining company is the voracious eagle. Predation is the natural habit of American corporations. McCabe values the free enterprise system, but he doesn't want to be eaten like the frog or taken advantage of by some anonymous men he doesn't trust. The frog's remark to the eagle then expresses McCabe's own skepticism. You wouldn't shit me, would you? Well, in creating his anti-Western with McCabe as its anti-hero, Altman presents really his take on a new Western plot that other filmmakers were beginning to explore in the 1960s and 70s. And this plot concerned the closing of the American frontier and the threat to rugged individualism and to lawless freedom that certain corporations, railroads, big business posed. Altman treats it with greater irreverence, I think, than any other, but we do find that basic plot in two other major films of the period. In 1969, we find it in Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, and we also find it in a film you may know, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now, McCabe rebukes the company both as a gambler and as a dreamer, and as I've also suggested, perhaps most important, because he desperately needs to prove his masculinity to Mrs. Miller, and by extension to himself, by rejecting it. He does this then by asserting his independence, which elicits Sears' veiled threat, quote, if we can't negotiate as businessmen, and then he trails off. Now, McCabe mistakenly thinks that Sears is bluffing here, but this isn't a card game. Mrs. Miller knows that they're not bluffing. McCabe has arranged for their first sexual rendezvous that night as a patron. Now, in preparation for this night with Mrs. Miller, McCabe has taken a bath and sobered up. But when he arrives and knocks on her door, she is in the midst of preparing her opium pipe. She's annoyed at his intrusion, and she chides him for missing the birthday party. McCabe ignores this and immediately brags that he just turned down the mining company's buyout offer of $5,500 because he knows they were bluffing. He wants to impress her with his virility and his business acumen. But Mrs. Miller tells him that he has made a mistake and that he better hope that they come back with a counteroffer because the company might, quote, put a bullet in you. But of course, McCabe doesn't listen. When Sears and Hollander do return and up the offer to $6,500, he makes an extravagant gambler's demand. He wants between $14,000 and $15,000, and then he exacerbates that insult by offering these straight-laced men the services of prostitutes, which appall them. When McCabe returns to Mrs. Miller, he feels as if he has now surely reclaimed his masculinity, and he wants her to know it even before they have sex. Take a look.
When you get yourself in a gambling situation, you've got to know when the other fellow's bluffing. And didn't I tell you them two dimpers would come back to me? Huh? I told you that. See, once in a while, you could just learn to trust me, Constance. Everything's gonna be a lot easier. You're gonna find that out.
How wide do you think they'll go?
I don't know. Tomorrow morning at breakfast is gonna tell the tale. You're a funny little thing. Sometimes you're just as sweet. And then other times, I'm just a station on your way. I know I'm not your lover. She used to wear her hair like you, except when she was sleeping. And then she'd weave it on a loom of smoke and gold and
The scene is rich with dramatic irony. Dramatic irony, of course, turns on the discrepancy between what the audience knows and what a character knows, in this case, McCabe. We understand that Hollander regards McCabe as an incorrigible fool. He's leaving. McCabe has burned his bridges and will suffer the consequences that Hollander suggested when he said that the company's executives, quote, are going to be quite concerned, if you know what I mean. McCabe doesn't understand this as we do. And once again, he fails to pick up the hint of violence in that veiled threat. So that when he returns to Mrs. Miller's room, in the scene we just saw, he's so filled with hubris that he demands she open the door, and for the first time, when he comes in, he calls her Constance. It's an ironic name because Mrs. Miller is, after all, the traveling lady of Leonard Cohen's song. She belongs to no one, and her only constancy, her only allegiance is to herself. The second thing that McCabe ironically fails to understand here, but that we do, is that the change he sees in Mrs. Miller now, as she becomes sweet and girlish and smiling, is a result of the opium she has just smoked in his absence. She's now very high. But McCabe is so proud of himself, so pleased to be able to brag to her about his assertion of cagey independence, that he almost gets into bed without paying. Mrs. Miller reminds him to do so, and we recall the line from that song, I know I'm not your lover. No, not at this moment in any romantic sense. Mrs. Miller giggles coyly at the idea of sleeping with her business partner, but she also does seem to feel some genuine affection for McCabe, despite his pretensions. It's not a profound love, but there is clearly affection there. But then Altman zooms to the box where McCabe has puts his $5, and in doing so, Altman reminds us that even affection human interactions in capitalist America finally reduce to monetary transactions. But Mrs. Miller now lets McCabe luxuriate in the dangerous role that he has chosen, if only for a few hours, in her own drug-induced mellowness. She doesn't criticize his rash refusal of the new offer, nor does she laugh at him when he says that she ought to trust him more. And the sex that follows crowns McCabe's reacquisition of masculine self-respect. But it's also a trap, because from here onward, McCabe feels now that he must live up to the image of the shrewd, brazen man, this idea of himself that he has tried to create in Mrs. Miller's eyes, and feels he's succeeded. He miscalculates, of course, in predicting that Sears and Hollander will continue to negotiate. When he finds that they've left town after having made their counteroffer, it dawns on him that he has overplayed his hand and that his life is now in danger. But having adopted the role of the brave rebel, McCabe feels compelled to act it out, certainly for Mrs. Miller's sake and for his own. So at Bart's funeral, he learns that a stranger has come to town, and although he's terrified and assumes that it is from the mining company, he nevertheless, in fulfillment of the role he's chosen, goes out alone to confront what he assumes to be a hired killer. But at this point, as Malick did in Days of Heaven, Altman brings this plot to a point of tension only to diffuse it momentarily. We recall the aerial clowns in Days of Heaven. Here we get something that has the similar effect, because the stranger turns out to be an innocent and rather comical young cowboy played by Keith Carradine. Likeable, a harmless fellow who the whores dote on, and who is, after all, like McCabe, playing out a role and very little more with his hat and with his gun. They're merely decorative. Altman sets the two, McCabe and the young cowboy, up as counterparts as they approach one another at opposite ends of the rope bridge. Both have been enacting roles of Western masculinity that now threatens to force them into action. Happily, it's diffused. Have a look.
That death hath lost his venom sting. I sleep in Jesus, time nor space divorce this precious hiding place on Indian plains.
You're not going down there, are you?
Ain't nothing to worry about. I told you that.
Well, you got your gun on you?
Yeah. Don't make no difference.
What you want?
Wait a minute, mister. I don't mean no...
And what'd you come up here for?
Well, I heard you had the fanciest whorehouse in the whole territory up here. Gee, it's been so long since I had a piece of ass.
Well, you come on up here. I'll show you what you're looking for.
Don't worry. You're going to do just fine here.
During the funeral, you'll note, Mrs. Miller exchanges a knowing glance with the young mail-order bride. She seems to see into her, to understand her and to identify with her. Later, she tells her, "You're small, just like me." And she assures her that having sex with men for money is no different than performing her duty for the deceased Bart. It's just more honest and certainly more lucrative. Without words, it's understood that she'll go to work for Mrs. Miller. When the stranger appears in a long shot, Mrs. Miller is concerned for McCabe because she, too, has been expecting the company's henchman. She knows that McCabe has been posturing, and her protective feeling for him goes beyond that of a business partner. Again, she feels some real affection. She follows him as he leaves the burial site to meet the stranger. The town, after all, still clings to the myth that McCabe is a gunslinger who once killed a man, and this burden of the reputation as a man who knows how to fire guns only increases his pressure to confront the newcomer, to keep up their idea, the town's idea, and Mrs. Miller's idea. But when McCabe is asked if he has his weapon, in a truthful moment he mutters, "It don't make no difference," as if to say, "I don't know how to use it." Now at this point, even as he goes to face the presumed enemy, McCabe simply cannot imagine firing a gun. As the opening song suggests, he's a man whose hands would reach for the sky just to surrender. Altman presents the meeting first in a long shot and then through a series of shot-reverse shots that heighten the tension as McCabe approaches. "What do you want?" he asks. The young cowpoke, who's as frightened as McCabe, says he's heard about the whorehouse and that he hasn't had a piece of ass for a long time, such as never. Now this is a posture. He's almost certainly a virgin, and the prostitutes later amuse themselves by sexually initiating him. The fact that he wears his Stetson in the brothel, and along with his long johns, reinforces the fact that this is just a costume for him. It's a prop for his play acting the role of drifting cowboy. Neither this young man nor McCabe has any intrinsic sense of self. Neither has a stable core of personal ego, nor are they in any way defined by pre-established mythic typologies, the way Malick's characters are. Instead, they're both inventing themselves, performing roles, but they both become fatally imprisoned in those performances of masculinity, we'll see, by the same threat. Altman foreshadows both fatalities, McCabe's and the cowboys, at the end of the clip. As Bart's funeral wind down, we cut to a shot of the riders on horseback moving through the forest. These are the killers that McCabe has been anticipating. They're bringing more death to town. This is clear from the moment they arrive. The fiddle music and the dancing on the sheet of ice come to an abrupt halt, and the men disperse. In the silence, we hear only the wind. The leader of the trio is an enormous man named Butler, who wears a barbaric wolfskin coat that only magnifies his intimidating size. Altman uses another of the film's many zooms to show a close-up of his boot and the metal stirrups and the barrel of the rifle. These brutal images characterize the man. He's a flamboyantly attired killer with a British accent and a taste for sadism. He's accompanied by an Indian named Breed and a younger killer named the Kid, or called the Kid. Inside the brothel, there had been an atmosphere of gaiety as the cowpoke reveled with the prostitutes, but now the tone turns to one of menace, as it had earlier when we cut from the Christmas celebration to the fight that ended Bart's life. Mrs. Miller tells McCabe the men have, quote, come for killing, nothing else, and she urges him to flee town in a covered wagon, noting that he'll save face that way because no one will see him deserting. But having finally established his manhood, he believes, in Mrs. Miller's eyes, McCabe clings to that role, telling her, I know what I'm doing. He has dispatched someone to try to catch up with Sears and Hollander and tell them that he'll accept their deal. But it's clearly too late. When Mrs. Miller offers to lie and to tell people that he's gone away on business, McCabe says, if a man's fool enough to get into business with a woman, she's not going to think much of him. Put it another way, forming the partnership itself, McCabe suggests, was a blow to his masculine independence. And now, after he thought he'd reclaimed that virility, she still evidently thinks he's not that kind of a man because she thinks he'd even consider fleeing from danger. No, he won't do that. He's determined to prove her wrong by reaffirming both his business acumen and his courage. I won't slip out of town. I won't let you lie for me. But when Butler is asked if he'll meet with McCabe, Butler says there's nothing to talk about. He's not there to negotiate. He's sent in only when negotiations fail. And Butler makes this clear when McCabe goes to Sheehan's to try to bribe him with some cigars. When he arrives, Butler is finishing a racist story about how the fine for killing a Chinese mine worker is merely $50. All life is cheap in Butler's eyes. And by the way, no, I won't take your cigar. Have one of mine. Have a look.
They won't make a deal for $62.50 if they don't count my personal property in that. And, I mean, that's provided that they buy my inventory separate.
How much is that?
Well, $350. 300. And then so you got your 300 and 62. So that's $65.50. 65.50. And well, let's just make that an even 6,500, and you got yourself a deal.
I don't make deals.
Well, what you doing up here if you don't make deals?
I came up here to hunt bear. I hear it's very good around
Oh,
here.
get off. The bear. You don't work for Harrison Shaughnessy?
Sometimes. Only when they can't make a deal.
Well, look, now, that's just what I'm trying to tell you. This here deal can be made.
Not with me.
I guess what I got to do is get in touch with this fellow Sears. See you boys later.
McCabe, were you ever called Pudgy?
Long time ago, why?
My best friend's best friend was Bill Roundtree. Did you kill him?
I was in a poker game when he got shot, but I didn't kill him.
Are you calling his best friend a liar?
Wait a minute, I ain't calling nobody a liar. Bill Roundtree got caught marking the queens. He went for his gun and he got shot, that's all.
I'm going to count 10. If you're not on that bridge by the time I'm finished, I'm going to get very cross with you.
I just want you boys to know that I ain't wearing no gun.
Paddy, come here. Who the hell was this Bill Roundtree?
Well, he was real well known.
I mean, who said he shot him?
I told you, everybody. He shot him with a derringer.
That man? That man never killed anybody.
What Butler performs here is nothing less than a public shaming before the town's assembled patriarchy. It's not enough that Butler's planning to kill McCabe. He wants first to torture and humiliate him. He's a smooth-talking psychopath. When McCabe enters Sheehan's, just before the clip begins, we find Butler dropping a tray loudly at McCabe's feet and then watching him reflexively bend down and pick it up like a servant. Butler enjoys forcing McCabe to back down, to squirm, to grovel. He induces him to confess the amount of money that he asked for and then to retract it as if he were offering him some kind of a lifeline. But it isn't, because just when McCabe thinks that he may have saved himself, Butler ends this cat and mouse game by telling him, "I don't make deals." Essentially, it's too late. Although Butler claims to be in town to hunt bear, he makes his murderous intentions quite clear when he asks McCabe if he's Pudgy McCabe, that glamorous gunslinger that Sheehan had misidentified him for when he'd arrived and that the town had eagerly accepted. McCabe had not denied it. Now, Butler has clearly heard this rumor. Now, if McCabe denies that he's Pudgy McCabe, he will be exposed before the town as a liar, because up until now he's acquiesced to the legendary identity of this man. In fact, he's exploited this persona with its aura of mystery and danger to impress the town, win his gambling money, and start the whorehouse. But on the other hand, actively embracing and perpetuating the invention, as he tries to do here, proves even more mortifying than denying it would have been. Butler, like Mrs. Miller, sees through McCabe's role-playing immediately, and he traps McCabe in the lie that he is, in fact, Pudgy McCabe when he claims that the slain Bill Roundtree was his best friend's best friend. The invention sends McCabe slinking away when Butler threatens violence. But this is all, for Butler, a kind of sadistic theater, with his Fu Manchu mustache and carefully timed delivery. Now, by creating a role for himself as Bill Roundtree's friend's friend, he strips McCabe of McCabe's own fabricated identity and puts it pungently when he says, "That man never shot anybody." Strips McCabe of all of his accumulated reputation. Yet ironically, that man that Butler says never shot anyone will shoot. Indeed, he will shoot and kill Butler himself. We cut to McCabe alone in his room doing something that has really no precedent in American Westerns and is fascinating and risky, and certainly something that's consistent with Altman's trope of dramatic role-playing. McCabe delivers an agonized soliloquy. Have a look.
Never did fit in this goddamn town. God, I hate when them bastards put their hands on you. I tell you, sometimes when I'm taking a look at you, I just keep looking and looking. So I won't feel your little body up against me so bad, I think I'm gonna bust. I keep trying to tell you in a lot of different ways. Just one time you can be sweet without no money around. I think I could...
Well, I'll tell you something. I got poetry in me.
I do, I got poetry in me, but...
I ain't gonna put it down on paper. I ain't no educated man. I got sense enough not to try.
Can't never say nothing to you. If you just one time let me run the show, You're just freezing my soul, that's what you're doing.
Freezing my soul.
Now, ironically, McCabe, it turns out, does have some poetry in him. Even though he says he can't find the words to tell Mrs. Miller that he loves her, there's a kind of lyricism in these mutterings to himself. And also when he gets to her room and declares himself. The scene in his own room begins with McCabe looking in the mirror as he speaks, preparing himself to enact a role, just as he had first rehearsed lines after getting off his horse at the beginning of the film when he entered town. But now it's different. This is an unfamiliar role that will require packing a gun in order to go out and defend himself. Packing a gun not just for show as an accoutrement, but actually for his own protection. McCabe is staying in town in an attempt to live up to the heroic image that he's tried to create for Mrs. Miller, as I've suggested, because it's her view of him that he really cares about. far more than the view of the men in the town before whom he has just been discredited. If only Mrs. Miller would let him sleep with her one time without paying, he tells himself, if only she'd do that, and if only, quote, she would let him run the show, then he'd feel sure that he meant something to her as a man and would feel that he had reclaimed the masculinity that he'd thought he'd had earlier. But as he puts it, she's freezing my soul, a phrase which, when we look back, clearly anticipates the final scene in which McCabe is literally freezing to death in the snow, while inside, Mrs. Miller smokes her opium pipe. McCabe tries two final strategies to save himself without, in any way, escaping the situation. They both, however, require going to the larger town of Bear Claw, which is several hours away, and from which he returns. He goes first to the mining company outpost there, hoping to find Sears and Hollander, but learns that they have left. So he then turns to the local town lawyer, named Clement Samuels, clearly a play on Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain. And what we get in this meeting is one of the most satirical moments, I think, in the film. Have a look.
Protect a little guy like yourself, McCabe. And I'm at your service free of charge. Free? That's what I said. You don't have to pay me anything. It would be an honor for the next senator from the state of Washington to be your servant before the scales of justice.
Mighty decent of you. I don't know.
When a man, McCabe, when a man goes into the wilderness and with his bare hands gives birth to a small enterprise, nourishes it, and tends it while it grows, well, I'm here to tell you that no dirty sons of bitches are going to take it away from him. Now, ain't that right?
Well,
You're damn right it's right. Now, you take that there company, Harrison and Shaughnessy. They are stockholders. Now, do you think they want their stockholders and the public thinking that their management isn't imbued with all the principles of fair play and justice? The very values that make this country what it is today? Busting up these trusts and monopolies is at the very root of the problem of creating a just society. Damn it, McCabe, I'm here to tell you that this free enterprise system of ours works. And working within it, we can protect the small businessman and the big businessman as well.
Well, yeah. I just didn't want to get killed.
McCabe comes to the lawyer because, as he puts it, I just don't want to get killed. But the lawyer is a glib and dishonest opportunist. He offers for free to defend McCabe against the mining company because he says he wants to, quote, protect the little guy. But it's really just to promote his own political aspirations. The publicity McCabe's case would generate would establish Samuel's reputation throughout Washington state. His monologue sounds like a cynical politician's stump speech that recycles several of the American cliches that the film explodes. Samuel says that he believes in the myth of the Western frontier, where men like McCabe can create their dreams and do so with their own bare hands. He casts himself as a defender of the little guy, small independent businessmen against dangerous monopolies like the mining corporation. Quote, those sons of bitches are out to crush the little guy, he says. But no sooner does Samuels say this than he turns around and defends capitalism at large as essential to the American dream, something that McCabe himself has done. Samuels even invokes the bootstrap myth that the film's action has shown is so bankrupt. He says free enterprise works, and he tells McCabe, quote, the little guy has the same rights and opportunities as the big companies, something that the film has shown to be absolutely untrue. Samuels is so wrapped up in his theatrics, as if he were addressing a political rally, that he seems temporarily to forget that McCabe is his actual audience. The lawyer doesn't really believe any of this blather, of course, but it's clear that he'll say anything that he thinks the public wants to hear. And he is here certainly willing to sacrifice McCabe as a client for his own advancement. He flatters McCabe by telling him that surely his case will attract the attention of the great attorney Williams Jennings Bryant, and that will make him, Samuels, a famous man, and maybe McCabe too. However, he can't help McCabe in any practical way because the court case and the publicity that he claims would protect McCabe would take months to develop. Months, weeks, even days that McCabe clearly does not have. Yet, after this interview with this cynical man, McCabe returns to Mrs. Miller and parrots the lawyer's language about the little guy in support of his own performance of bravado. He says, sometimes a man's got to stick his hand in the fire to see what he's made of. Well, this sounds like a line McCabe has heard somewhere before and simply recycled. Mrs. Miller tells him again to leave town because, quote, they'll do something awful to you, McCabe. But her concern only emboldens his performance of masculinity. He says, nothing's going to happen to me, little lady. As they talk, Mrs. Miller is cooking him breakfast. And when she turns away and weeps at the prospect of his imminent death, McCabe smiles with amazement at this conventional female show of affection. It's what he's been waiting for from a woman, a sign of emotional weakness, a confirmation she sees him and cares for him as a man. Now, in illustration of the peril that Mrs. Miller describes, the youngest killer gratuitously guns down the good-natured young cowboy in what is the film's most shocking and disturbing scene. We see the cowboy bidding fond farewell to the prostitutes who send him off with hugs and kisses, especially the ex-mail-order bride. And then we cut to the kid shooting at a jug that he's thrown out on the frozen river. The kid is trying to impress his two older colleagues with his marksmanship. And when he misses the jug, he's embarrassed, and he insists that what he really meant to do was miss it, and that he's trying to shoot around it to make it float. Like everyone else in the film, it seems, he's playing a role, trying to live up to a model of dangerous assassin, that of a dangerous assassin, so that when the cowboy starts across the bridge, you have two individuals playing roles, once again confronting one another at the end of this expanse. Now, having been frustrated in his trial of manhood, the kid now is desperate, even more desperate, to prove his killer's proficiency to Butler and to Breed as they look on. Have a look.
I wasn't trying to hit it. The trick is not to hit it, but to make it float.
Hey, hold it, Sonny.
What?
Hold up on your target practice a minute. I don't want to get shot.
Well, then get off the bridge, you saddle tramp.
I want to buy some socks. I got a long ride ahead of me.
What's wrong with the socks you got on?
I wore 'em out running around half naked in that whorehouse over there. That's really quite a place. You been there yet?
Take off your boots and show me.
You're joshing me.
I said take off your boots and show me, you egg sucker.
I ain't gonna do that.
What are you wearing that gun for?
Nothing. I just wear it. Can't hit nothing with it.
Well, that don't make no sense. What kind of a gun is it?
Oh.
Them's good guns. That's what I got. Must be something wrong with it.
Nah, it's me. I just can't shoot good.
Well, let me see it. Come on. Maybe I can fix it for you.
Okay.
The encounter begins with a public humiliation that recalls the one that Butler inflicted on McCabe. Take off your boots. But it turns more deadly. Ironically, with his Dutch boy haircut, the killer is outwardly looking as young and fresh-faced as his victim. They're counterparts in that they're both insecure as they try to perform these roles of Western masculinity. One of them, at least, more benign than the other, but both roles. Now, if the whorehouse was the proof of the cowboy's manhood, a kind of initiation into it in sexual terms, then killing the cowboy is the kid's attempt to assert his own virility, in this case through an act of violence. Now, that the shooting turns on a trick, getting the cowboy to try to show him his gun, only heightens the ruthlessness that the kid wants to demonstrate, his cold-bloodedness. The cowboy shot falls into the icy river, and in so doing foreshadows McCabe's death in the snow. Altman holds an extended shot of the cowboy's body floating face up in the water to underline the senselessness of the encounter and the lawlessness of the town, where Sheehan and the other men simply turn away from the dead man, as they will shortly turn away when McCabe faces his assassins. We cut to Mrs. Miller's room, where McCabe is undressing. He knows now that he's doomed, and his words are a kind of valedictory declaration of love. He says, "Constance, you're the best-looking woman I ever saw, and all I ever wanted to do is put a smile on your face." There is poetry in McCabe. A moment later, something even more remarkable and unexpected occurs. Have a look.
I ain't no good saying I'm sorry. I don't know where it is. I guess I ain't never been this close to nobody before.
Hey, why don't you get under the covers? Huh?
Hey, Constance.
Yeah, you don't need to say nothing.
I'm sorry.
Come on.
Well, I lived with a child of snow when I was a soldier, and I fought every man for her until the nights grew colder. She used to wear her hair like you, except when she was sleeping.
What is McCabe sorry for? For not listening to Mrs. Miller? For not taking the money that would have made them both rich? For posturing in a way that is going to get him killed? Yes, he's sorry for all three of these things, I think. The word sorry encompasses them. But in weeping as he speaks, and in allowing Mrs. Miller to see him weep, McCabe lets down the mask of frontier masculinity he's been trying so hard to uphold in their relationship. She sees this vulnerability, and she responds with genuine tenderness. "Get under the covers and don't say nothing," she tells him. This is a human invitation to enter her bed, not their customary financial transaction. There is no need to pay at this moment. It's a gesture predicated upon Mrs. Miller's certainty that McCabe will die. And it's not a sexual moment, but rather one in which she strokes his head and comforts him as she would a young child. It's an expression of her pity and her tenderness, but it is also clearly a goodbye to him, as his declaration of love seemed like a goodbye to her. When McCabe wakes up, the snow has begun to fall, and Altman uses a violent zoom to show the killers already out and looking for McCabe. McCabe rises to face the killers in a gunfight the way lawmen often do in great westerns, like, for example, John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But McCabe, of course, isn't a lawman, and there is no law in Presbyterian Church at all, which is one of the anti-Western tropes in the film. Knowing that he'll get no help, knowing there is no law, knowing that he needs cover, McCabe heads first to the church that gives the town its name. A zoom follows his line of sight to the bell tower, where he would, if he could make it there, would have both cover and a view of his enemies down below. In fact, McCabe sees them spreading out when he gets to that perch. Now, spreading out from this perch. Now, there's a long tradition, I think dating back to the Middle Ages, of churches as sanctuaries, both in the old frontier West as in medieval France. But here, that tradition fails because the parson expels McCabe at the point of McCabe's own shotgun when he comes down. This empty, quote, house of God not only fails as a site of community in the film, but the preacher, no doubt appalled by McCabe's status as a brothel keeper, sends him out weaponless in the snow to his almost certain death. So there is a certain grim justice then that this unsympathetic parson, this gesture of inhumanity, causes the cleric to be shot by Butler, who mistakes him for McCabe and blows the man's arm off. The lighted lamp in the parson's hand falls, igniting the church. McCabe next runs to his saloon for refuge and gets another revolver, drinks a whiskey with a raw egg in it to sustain him. We see from a high angle above McCabe on the floor doing these things, and it makes McCabe, even indoors, seem exposed and vulnerable as he is. He then goes out in search of a new, less obvious place of cover, an unfinished bathhouse. Now, Altman choreographs the gun battle that follows, as I noted last time, with deliberate echoes of the climactic scene in High Noon that I showed you the clip from last class. In both, we see an outnumbered man, alone and on the run, who uses the town's buildings to pick off his enemies and is wounded in the process as a shattered lantern ignites a fire. But the town here isn't tidy like the one that Gary Cooper moves through. Rather, Presbyterian Church is spread out, leaving McCabe much easier to spot. And the enemy is not, as it was in High Noon, a gang of criminals, but rather an American corporation. And the hero here doesn't live like Gary Cooper to go back to the woman who's waiting for him. No, he dies, and by the way, Mrs. Miller isn't waiting for him. Her theme song, Traveling Lady, contains the pleas, "Stay a while until the night is over," but Mrs. Miller doesn't stay. Rather, as we saw, she leaves McCabe while he is sleeping. This man, who the song says fought every man for her, is nonetheless a man she knows will die and does not wish to be there when he does. Now, it's true Mrs. Miller cares for him, but knowing he's doomed, as a pragmatist, she walks out into the night, aware that she will soon be traveling again. Yet, in a film that is so full of irreverent ironies and inversions, perhaps the greatest is that in this gunfight, McCabe, for all of his clumsiness, really does display some of the courage and resourcefulness of a prototypical Western hero, as if somehow in enacting this role, he discovers something that comes more naturally to him than he could have ever expected. Have a look. The kid's inexperience betrays him at the beginning of this clip. Instead of kicking in the door as Butler had done at the church, he enters the bathhouse and McCabe shoots him in the back. The kid falls into a steaming tub of water, and Altman shows his floating body echoing and reminding us of the kid's own victim, the cowboy, when he plunged into and floated in the river. As he falls, however, the kid fires a round that wounds McCabe in the stomach. Yet he's still able to stagger through the deepening out the door and through the deepening snow back to his saloon casino, where we see him bleeding and alone with no support. Outside, the town is busy responding to the burning church, with the only show of genuine community spirit other than what the brothel has supplied. Even the black couple is included as they form a bucket brigade and use the steam-powered tractor to try to save a building that, ironically, few of them seem to have been in, a building that has functioned for them as really nothing more but a symbol, as a kind of figurehead of the town. Even though the church then plays no role in their lives, they need, as I've suggested, the idea of it and its sanctity, something that it represents. Altman suggests, I think, in showing us this, that religion for them occupies the same illusory role as it does for many people in contemporary America. A self-described nation under God, but one which is more interested perhaps in the pretense than in the reality of any kind of demonstrated faith. This spurious outbreak of sanctimoniousness in the town is all the more troubling because these same townfolk who are saving the church are doing nothing to save McCabe, who has brought them more genuine gratifications and a more genuine sense of fragile community than the church ever did. Driven by terror and survival, McCabe proves Butler wrong. That man never killed anyone. That man kills him. He shoots his second victim, Breed, however, before that, through a window. But he knows that the Indians' trail of blood will soon lead Butler to him. So McCabe limps out in search of a new hideout. He goes to the mine, or tries to. Butler sees him running, highly visible against the snow, and he fires at McCabe with his blunderbuss, wounding him again. Have a look. McCabe is not a practiced gunman, but his talents as a card shark serve him well here. He knows how to bluff, how to fool people. He slides down a slope, playing dead, yet another enactment, yet another theatrical gesture, if you will, and then shoots Butler in the forehead when he approaches. The expression on Butler's face is one of astonishment before he collapses. Deception has enabled him now to kill all three assassins, but McCabe can't save himself. Staggering through the drifting snow with bullet wounds, he's in search of shelter as he had been at the start of the film, but there is no shelter now. He now finds nothing. Instead, he collapses in a snowdrift, paralyzed and bleeding to death just outside his brothel. But it's empty now because the town is busy celebrating the saving of the church. Things have clearly begun to return to normal for the town folk. They're celebrating with whiskey, and the black couple have gone off by themselves. Like McCabe, Mrs. Miller is also now alone. She hasn't retreated at this point to her room, but now has retreated on her way to traveling away to the Chinese settlement, where she finds her usual refuge, opium. Have a look at the end of the film.
Traveling lady, stay a while until the night is over. I'm just a station on your way. I know I'm not your lover. Well, I live with a child of snow when I was a soldier, and I fought every man for her until the nights grew colder. She used to wear her hair like you, except when she was sleeping. And then she'd weave it on a loom of smoke and gold and breathing. And why are you so quiet now, standing there in the doorway? You chose your journey long before you came upon this highway.
Altman ends the film by intercutting long shots of McCabe nearly buried in the snow and close-ups of Mrs. Miller that emphasize the distinction not just between heat and cold, interior and exterior, but between life and death. We move to an extreme close-up of Mrs. Miller's eye, and then, from the perspective of that eye, Altman gives us Mrs. Miller's extended, subjective camera view of the opium vial as she sees it and rotates it slowly in her fingers until it becomes merely a blur of color. As the shot suggests, she's lost in a drug haze. She knows that McCabe is dead without knowing exactly how. And this drifting into another state of consciousness is her way of forgetting him. It is the first gesture, or the first stage, if you will, in the travelers that will surely follow for her. As he dies in a snowdrift, she drifts into a dream. There's both sadness and elegiac beauty, I think, in this ending of two isolated souls in a vast, untamed landscape who had become close, but who were ultimately, as the ending suggests, never able fully to connect.